Kenyan President William Ruto has reportedly made multiple attempts to reach Vietnam's president, only for his calls to go unanswered. The diplomatic efforts were aimed at securing the release of a Kenyan citizen, Margaret, who is allegedly in distress in the Southeast Asian nation. The situation has sparked widespread concern in Kenya, with many questioning why Vietnam's leader refused to engage with President Ruto. Sources indicate that Ruto's administration had been working behind the scenes to negotiate Margaret's freedom, but the lack of communication has frustrated these efforts. Margaret, a Kenyan citizen, is believed to be facing serious legal or humanitarian challenges in Vietnam. While specific details about her predicament remain unclear, reports suggest she may have been detained or is in urgent need of government intervention. The Kenyan government, through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has been actively seeking diplomatic channels to resolve the matter. President Ruto personally stepped in, making direct calls to his Vietnamese counterpart, hoping to expedite the process. However, sources close to the negotiations claim that Vietnam's president either ignored or declined the calls. This has led to growing concerns over the state of Kenya-Vietnam diplomatic relations and the fate of Margaret. The silence from Vietnam has raised questions about the reasons behind the declined calls. Analysts speculate that it could be due to diplomatic tensions, legal constraints, or Vietnam's internal policies on foreign interventions in judicial matters. In Kenya, the news has sparked public outcry, with human rights activists urging the government to escalate efforts to bring Margaret home. Social media has been flooded with messages calling for immediate action, with hashtags demanding justice for her trending online. Opposition leaders have also weighed in on the matter, criticizing Ruto's administration for what they call a failure in diplomatic engagement. Some argue that Kenya should have pursued alternative approaches before resorting to direct calls to Vietnam's president. The lack of response from Vietnam has also fueled speculation about the effectiveness of Kenya's foreign policy. Critics argue that if a head of state's calls can be ignored, it reflects poorly on Kenya's diplomatic standing on the global stage. Foreign affairs experts, however, caution against reading too much into the declined calls. They argue that Vietnam's leadership may have protocol restrictions that prevent direct engagement on certain legal matters, particularly if they involve criminal cases. Kenya's government has remained tight-lipped about its next course of action. However, insiders suggest that alternative diplomatic measures are being explored, including engagement through regional allies or international bodies. The situation has also brought renewed attention to the safety of Kenyan citizens living and working abroad. Cases of Kenyans facing legal troubles in foreign countries have been on the rise, with calls for stronger government support mechanisms. Vietnam has yet to issue an official statement regarding the matter. The country's silence has only intensified speculation and concern, with many Kenyans anxiously awaiting an update on Margaret's fate. Meanwhile, President Ruto is said to be exploring other high-level diplomatic options to ensure Margaret's case is addressed. His government is reportedly in discussions with Vietnam's embassy in Kenya to seek a breakthrough. Margaret's family has publicly pleaded with the government to intervene urgently. In emotional statements, they expressed fears over her well-being and urged authorities to do everything possible to bring her back home safely. The Kenyan public remains divided on the best approach to handle the crisis. While some believe that diplomatic patience is necessary, others argue that Kenya should take a stronger stance against Vietnam's refusal to engage. As pressure mounts on the government, the coming days will be critical in determining whether Kenya can successfully negotiate Margaret's release. The international community is also closely watching how the situation unfolds. The case serves as a stark reminder of the challenges faced by foreign nationals in distress and the limitations governments sometimes face in securing their citizens' safety abroad. For now, Kenya waits, hoping that Vietnam will eventually break its silence and respond to President Ruto's calls before it's too late for Margaret. Diplomatic experts argue that Vietnam's reluctance to engage could stem from internal policies that strictly limit presidential involvement in foreign legal matters. Some countries prefer such cases to be handled at lower diplomatic levels before escalating them to the head of state. Despite this, critics in Kenya insist that Vietnam's refusal to pick up the calls is a sign of disregard for Kenya's diplomatic efforts. They argue that at the very least, Vietnam's leadership should have acknowledged President Ruto's concerns and offered a response. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kenya has reportedly reached out to Vietnam's ambassador in Nairobi for clarification. However, sources indicate that the response from Vietnam's diplomatic mission has been minimal, further deepening the mystery. Amid this diplomatic standoff, Kenyans on social media have launched campaigns urging the government to escalate the matter to the African Union and other international bodies. Some have even suggested involving the United Nations if diplomatic efforts continue to stall. Legal experts point out that if Margaret is facing criminal charges in Vietnam, Kenya must tread carefully to avoid interfering with another country's judicial process. However, they stress that this does not justify Vietnam's refusal to engage diplomatically. The opposition in Kenya has seized on the issue to criticize Ruto's leadership, calling it an embarrassment for the country. Some opposition figures claim that Kenya's foreign policy has weakened under Ruto's administration, making it easier for other nations to ignore diplomatic requests. Political analysts, however, argue that such criticisms are premature. They contend that Kenya still has diplomatic avenues to explore, and that international relations are often complex, requiring patience and strategy rather than public pressure. Meanwhile, Margaret's family remains in anguish as uncertainty looms over her fate. They have urged the government to disclose any new information regarding its efforts to secure her release, emphasizing that every passing day increases their anxiety. Civil society organizations in Kenya have also weighed in, urging Vietnam to at least provide information about Margaret's condition. Some groups have called for protests outside Vietnam's embassy in Nairobi if the silence continues. Back in Vietnam, little is known about Margaret's current status. Reports suggest that she may be held incommunicado, raising fears that she could be facing harsh treatment or legal proceedings. Without proper legal representation, Kenya's legal community has called for government intervention to ensure Margaret gets a fair trial. If she is indeed facing charges, some lawyers have suggested that Kenya should provide legal aid or request consular access to monitor her case. International human rights groups are also starting to take notice of the situation. If the case gains more attention globally, Vietnam could face pressure to respond and provide details about why it has ignored Kenya's diplomatic efforts. Some Kenyans have questioned why President Ruto made direct calls instead of using alternative diplomatic channels first. However, government sources defend the move, saying the urgency of the situation required high-level intervention. Experts in international relations note that diplomatic snubs like this can damage bilateral ties. They warn that if Vietnam continues to ignore Kenya's calls, it could strain future relations, affecting trade, tourism, and other areas of cooperation. Vietnam and Kenya have maintained relatively stable diplomatic relations over the years, with growing trade and investment ties. However, this incident could create friction between the two nations, leading to unintended economic consequences. Some Kenyans are now calling for retaliatory measures if Vietnam does not engage. Suggestions range from summoning Vietnam's ambassador for questioning to reconsidering trade agreements between the two countries. However, others argue that diplomatic patience is needed, as an aggressive approach could further complicate Margaret's situation. They urge the government to focus on quiet diplomacy, rather than escalating tensions publicly. The longer Vietnam remains silent, the more speculation grows. Some fear that Margaret's case might involve sensitive issues that the Vietnamese government does not want to discuss openly, leading to their refusal to engage at the highest level. Meanwhile, international media outlets are starting to pick up on the story, which could increase pressure on both governments to resolve the matter. If global attention intensifies, Vietnam may eventually have no choice but to respond. President Ruto's next move remains unclear, while his government continues to work behind the scenes. The lack of communication from Vietnam presents a major obstacle. The situation remains a test of Kenya's diplomatic strength and global influence. Margaret's case highlights a broader issue: the challenges that many Africans face when caught in legal trouble abroad. Similar incidents have occurred in countries like China and the Middle East, where foreign nationals often struggle to get government intervention. For now, the fate of Margaret remains uncertain. The Kenyan government must decide whether to push harder for a response or adopt a different strategy to ensure she receives the necessary assistance. As the situation unfolds, Kenyans wait anxiously, hoping that Vietnam will finally break its silence and offer answers before it is too late. The next few days will be critical in determining whether President Ruto's efforts will yield results or if Kenya will need to take a stronger diplomatic stance.